Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. What follows is a live recording of a fireside chat that I did with Kevin Indig. At Omniscient, we do a series of workshops that we call office hours, where usually we bring on expert guests to present about advanced topics in content, SEO, conversion, and general marketing topics. But in this one, however, we had an informal fireside chat conversation. So Kevin, as you probably know, is a powerhouse SEO thought leader who has worked at G2, Atlassian, Shopify, and he's advised a ton of successful companies as well. He runs the Growth Memo newsletter, to which I am a subscriber, and writes at kevin-indig.com. This is a shorter chat than usual due to our time constraints, but we still managed to pack in a ton of value and talk about SEO growth loops, finding a unique competitive advantage that you can index on in an increasingly competitive organic world, SEO aggregators versus integrators, and tons more of advanced content and SEO topics. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Kevin Indig. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Alex. Amazing intro. Good to be with you.
Yeah, and what are you reading right now?
I'm reading Working Backwards from, from Bill Carr and Colin Breyer. And it's really about how Amazon scaled their business and how they think about, goals and execution, operations, all that kind of stuff. Some really good nuggets in there.
You seem to, just from reading your newsletter and your blog, you seem to read quite widely and pull in lessons from kind of disparate areas, and that informs your takes on SEO and growth. Is that something you've consciously done? Is that a correct take, or how do you feel about that?
Yes, definitely something I'm doing very consciously. The problem or the challenge is that in SEO, there's a lot of kind of regurgitation or a lot of repetition, right? And so the way that I think about the discipline right now is much more multidisciplinary and much more inspired from, if you think about the work as an SEO is to give recommendations to other teams, right? To developers, to designers, to writers. And so why not, inform yourself and learn from very broad topics, because you're dealing with lots of people in broad fields. So something that I've done very consciously. And it also helps me to kind of, bring fresh takes to the table, because I think there's a lot of inspiration from economics, systems thinking, maybe even stuff like biology and all that kind of stuff. So it helps a lot to break out of silos and like these axioms that you kind of just accept.
That was an interesting take on how maybe the SEO team's role is played out in a company. You'd mentioned giving recommendations and like sort of facilitating and assisting other teams. Do you look at SEO in the ideal company? I'm sure like the real world versus theory, there's maybe a discrepancy there. But how do you see the role of SEO in the ideal scenario? Is it as a sort of center of excellence, a team of specialists? What is the function of SEO?
It's such a good question, because it's so fluid, right? It's very company dependent. And I would even argue that somebody who doesn't have SEO in their title or job description can do amazing SEO. And that makes it a bit more complicated. The case of a product manager, for example. And so it's a bit more company specific. If we're talking about a company that we can dive deeper into this mental model, but if you're talking about a company that has to create the content themselves, an aggregator, I think it's often a very classic marketing kind of setup and more of like a center of excellence constellation. And then when it comes to aggregators or companies that can scale SEO with an inventory, like a e-commerce product inventory, or maybe user-generated content, there I think is much better placed in product, and SEO is much more the output of a lot of different people. It might be enough to even just have one SEO who just consolidates all of this strategy and thinking, but then actually lots of people are working on SEO across the board.
Can you explain that theory on SEO aggregators versus integrators, and maybe how SEO teams can differ structure-wise in those different contexts? Sure.
So take a step back. This concept was inspired by Ben Thompson, who writes this amazing newsletter called Stratechery. It was not my brainchild. I just kind of transferred that over to SEO because I saw the same similarities. And so to define that real quick, an integrator is a company like Disney, for example. Disney is really interested in owning every aspect and part of the relationship with their customers. And they don't have scale effects in the sense that they have to produce all the content themselves, right? On the other hand, are aggregators. And aggregators capture demand to kind of define the rules for supply. They usually do that with a really good user experience. And a couple of examples could be Facebook, for example, right? They allow users to connect with each other, which creates a lot of demand, and therefore suppliers don't have power over demand anymore. It's really that the platform that channels demand has then power over suppliers. And when I'm saying power over, it's really just who kind of drives the relationship. It's not this kind of like dictatorship, even though we can maybe argue about that. But it brings us back to SEO. The fundamental difference is who creates the content. In the case of aggregators, it's not the company itself that creates the content. It would be, in the case for G2, for example, where previously, that's an aggregator. They have user-generated content in the form of software reviews, and they just channel that, bundle that, put that on a platform, make it accessible. And that means, to come back to your question, that technical SEO, for example, much more important than content marketing. And then on the other hand, for integrators, another company that worked at is Atlassian. Atlassian, even though they have an app marketplace and some aggregator playbooks, we're going to put them aside for now. For the most of it, they have to create the content themselves in the form of content hubs, blogs, and all that kind of stuff. And so they are content marketing, link building, much more important. And so I like to think of this mental model because it makes it very clear where you have to focus on, and it makes it very clear what the responsibilities of all the different people who work on SEO are.
How common do you think it is for a company to be both? Because you had mentioned Atlassian might have a couple of those different growth loops. And I worked at HubSpot, where HubSpot was like the classic integrator, I feel like, at the start. Or, the classic integrator, right? Like they've kind of built their own media company, did all the blogging, did the inbound stuff. But now their big bet seems to be on community and network. And they've got their app directory. And even this connect.com, where it seems like it's more UGC. And I feel like Shopify might have been similar in that way, where they kind of had both growth loops. But I don't know, is it possible to be both at the same time? Do you do one and then the other later on? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's actually an exciting question, because that's where it gets really interesting, right? What I see a lot of times is that the companies grow in one kind of, with one approach to a certain level, and then they plateau. And that's exactly the question where you want to ask yourself, okay, how can we run an aggregator playbook, or the other way around? And to come back to your question, yes, it's possible. Maybe not for every company, but a lot of companies out there eventually can funnel into both. We spoke about the Atlassian app marketplace. At Shopify, it was the theme marketplace. We also had an app marketplace. And there are other companies that do something similar. One example would be Figma, right? Figma started with a lot of self-created content, maybe on the blog, but then they open up their marketplace. And now this marketplace is thriving and bringing in a lot of organic traffic, and so there are playbooks of where companies that start with different conditions can go into. But it's a very strategic question, right? And that's why I'm so fascinated by this whole topic, because I think that's it can be much more impactful than thinking about how to maybe optimize a couple of articles or maybe do even better keyword research, right? But these are very, very specific, important decisions that companies have to make, oftentimes also related to product. So there's a big product component in this type of work.
My sense too, and this may be wrong, but I feel like it would be easy is probably the wrong word, but I feel like it would be more easy to be successful at the aggregator model later. Like doing the integrator model first would seem to you're building a user base that could translate into network effects that you actually have the users to build the UGC content later on, where there's that chicken and the egg problem early on. You also start to build up links and domain authority and all these things that help your content rank. Because I've seen in a couple of cases, companies try to do like the directory play, and they just end up like doing a bunch of duplicate, really shallow content, and then wasting a bunch of engineering resources. That's my sense anyway. I don't know if that's accurate.
I think it's very accurate. Aggregator plays are much harder to get off the ground. Once they're running, they can scale to much faster and maybe much higher than integrator playbooks. But none of them is better or worse. They're just very different approaches to go to market from an SEO perspective. And the importance is understanding when something, like what matters where. An example would be, as an integrator, sure, there's some technical SEO things that you might want to keep in mind, but technical SEO is just not that impactful. And we might have to define what counts as technical SEO in the first place, right? Whereas as an aggregator is absolutely crucial, and every decision you make from a technical perspective might scale in terms of impact the more you grow. So they're very different dynamics. And another example where it matters a lot is in validation. So I think I have a strong opinion that every company needs to validate SEO as a channel and validate that it's an impactful, significant channel before investing a ton of money into it. That is much, much easier as an integrator than as an aggregator, right? Because you spin up a content hub, right? You make sure it ranks well, and you see, okay, is the traffic converting? You might even have the chance to validate that, the landing pages convert with paid spend. So all sorts of things that you can come to a signal faster. Whereas for an aggregator, you have to build out an MVP of a product, get that going, ranking, and then see if there's actually significant traffic coming through. So all sorts of trade-offs for both sides. None of them is better. They're just different.
And when it comes to this idea of product-led SEO, is that exclusively a thing that's related to aggregators? It feels like it falls more on that side of the fence, at least.
I would say so, yes. I would say so. I think there might be interesting, maybe outliers, edge cases where you can do some product-led SEO as an integrator, but I would say 99% of the times it's really an aggregator play.
That makes sense. And then, so I wanted to touch back, something that we had talked about before was this concept of SEO growth loops. Could you define that really quickly? What is an SEO growth loop?
Yeah, for sure. An SEO growth loop is basically a self-reinforcing system where, that consists of several steps and where the growth of one step leads to the growth of all the subsequent steps. So an example of that would be in G2's case, right? You have reviews on your platform. In the beginning, those reviews were quote unquote bought, right? Literally somebody would go to a conference, pay users to leave reviews, right? Like it was a very kind of chicken and egg, like a very scrappy solve to the chicken and egg problem. And so you got a couple of reviews on your platform. Those reviews, you expose them to Google, you optimize your pages and all that kind of stuff. And they start to rank and they start to bring in organic traffic. Now that some users discover those reviews, a small fraction of that traffic will also leave reviews and will enable the platform to create new pages. Could be new vendor pages, but could also be comparison pages or category pages for new software categories. And so that's a self-reinforcing loop that if you optimize every step along the way, in the right way, that's a self-reinforcing system that can create its own dynamic. It needs to be kickstarted, but once it's up and going, the marginal cost for every new review is very close to zero. And that is incredibly powerful. It can be a game changer for companies. I mean, for G2, it certainly is and was. And it can mean significantly lower monetary investments.
Is the goal always to build an SEO growth loop? Because I read the article that you wrote on that, and it said that not all companies can do this, right? Or maybe not all companies, it's feasible to do this. So is there still a case to be made to invest in SEO if you can't build that self-reinforcing compounding loop?
Absolutely. And there can be compounding effects even without a self-reinforcing growth loop. HubSpot is a fantastic example, right? HubSpot created a lot of fantastic content. Eventually, that ventured into a guest posting program. But even before then, as soon as SEO significantly contributed to the bottom line, you can reinvest that money into new content and into hiring more people. So it doesn't always have to be a growth like a self-reinforcing system. It can also just be a system that brings in a lot of money, quote unquote, that you can then reinvest to do more SEO or better SEO. So, but you're absolutely right. Not every product has the potential to build the self-reinforcing system. There's certain conditions that have to be true for that to work out.
It feels like in the case of HubSpot, it is self-reinforcing in some ways, as long as you reinvest and you have a coherent strategy. But even if I think back, it's like, you start writing content, that content's typically expensive and differentiated in the beginning. And then over time, that content generates links. Over time, your site becomes stronger, you can more easily rank. So you maybe pay less for content. Maybe those guest writers, they actually want to write for you because you've got the brand, because you've got that exposure. So over time, I feel like the goal would be that it is cheaper and cheaper to get the same results or more results, even in that model.
Absolutely. And I love how you point out these scale effects, right? Because like obviously a self-reinforcing growth loop is amazing to have, but not everybody can do it, which doesn't mean that you don't benefit from doing all of this really well, and that there aren't like economies of scale where or economics of scale, better said, where you know, like things get cheaper, as you said, they get faster, you just get more efficient, and they need to, because the more you grow, the harder it gets to grow more, right? Like if you want to keep up, I mean, the beginning 50, 30%, no problem. But after a couple of years, you know, like growing 10% year over year might be so much harder to achieve, at least with the same kind of playbook. So yes, you get more efficient over time, and you actually have to get more efficient in order to sustain your growth.
And it seems like the one big benefit of these things is that it gives you defensibility when it comes to SEO. It makes it more predictable. It builds you a moat where it's harder to compete. And I'm thinking, like, if there's a HubSpot in your space, or if there's a G2 in your space, you know, for the reviews, like, and you've got this head start, you've got this moat, how do you compete? Or can you even compete on the same vectors as those companies? Or is that when you say, like, all right, I've got to like pivot and find like a different angle?
You definitely want to think about your competitive advantage. Zooming into this into G2 and that environment, one thing that we notice is that Google reserves a certain amount of spots in the search results for different types of sites. So when you look at the broader ecosystem that G2 plays in, it's basically a mix of three players. It's the review sites like a G2, Capterra, TrustRadius. You have publishers, sometimes affiliates, and you have the vendors themselves, right? Like a Salesforce, for example. And all these compete for kind of real estate on the first page of Google, but there's like a number of spots reserved for every keyword, and Google kind of plays around with that. So it is possible for you to compete. You first have to understand how you fit in and kind of what kind of player you are. There's obviously a lot more opportunity in the long tail. Typically for large platforms, long tail is not as attractive as short tail keywords. And then sometimes you can also just beat these players with better content and more backlinks. But the challenge that you have when you compete against a large platform, especially an aggregator, is that aggregators benefit from internal linking. And that, a lot of times companies just look at backlinks when they compete against platforms, which it's just not a complete picture. So anyway, zooming back out, so that's kind of the G2 play. Zooming back out, when we think about competitive advantage, there are different ways to compete, right? It can be self-created content, which we did as well eventually at G2. It can also be the frequency of content. It can be the depth of content. It can be bringing unique data to the content. It can be lead generation tools, for example, instead of pages, which also sometimes works for the same keyword. So there are all sorts of ways to compete. It's not always that you have to compete head to head. And I feel like that's something that too many companies are not really thinking about. But at the end of the day, you can build and lean into a competitive advantage, very similar to how you can lean into that on the business level as a whole.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked about quite a bit in our content, is that content strategy is definitely not just a list of keywords, because that ignores the context by which that other competitor that you're basically getting those keyword ideas from, the advantages that they already have, and like how you're actually going to differentiate from that. So I feel like that's a missing factor, is like, how am I different? Why am I better? Why do I deserve to usurp these companies that have this established position already?
100%. And how do you make your content stand out, right? This is another thing that companies don't really ask themselves enough, especially when they have to create the content themselves. But how do you make something that's best in class for a specific keyword? What a lot of people, or too many people, do is they just they scan the top search results and say, okay, this is what has to be in the content, and then they send that off to the races. But there's so much more you can do, and that you have to do these days as content game gets more competitive. And I feel like once you have a strong strategy, every door is open. Sure, you add the kind of all the SEO kind of parameters on top of that, like, can I even compete for this keyword? Is it competition too high? Do I have the right backlinks? Do I have the right optimization, title, like all of that? Sure, that has to be in place. But at the end of the day, there has to be strategic level that I don't see enough people operate on, where you ask yourself, what are my strengths and weaknesses? What is my competitive landscape? And what are my unique abilities that I can bring to the table to create something better than anybody else that is maybe not even possible to copy?
It seems like more and more the table stakes here are being democratized, and like the barrier to entry on the basics is becoming lower and lower. So that it's becoming even more important. It's like if you take like the most like basic kind of silly case, it's like everybody has access, or everybody can get access to something like Ahrefs or SEMrush and get the same data for the same keywords and the same prioritization list. And then you pay a couple $100 for ClearScope or Surfer, and you get the same template and the same like sort of content brief. And then you use something like Jasper or an AI copywriting tool to get like a pretty good version of that fits and checks all the boxes, or hire a freelancer who's probably going to take the first 10 listings on Google, rehash that, maybe add 200 words. And then what you're left with is all of that was easy to do, but it was also easy to do for all the competitors and the people who are already incumbents.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And this is, I mean, like, this might work for like some very low competitive keywords, or maybe some topics are just not a lot of content, right? And Google will rank you relatively quickly because there's no better option. But in other cases, you have to figure out how to make this even better. One way, just to make that a bit more tactile, is, for example, to hire subject matter experts and let them review the content. If not write content, that can get very expensive very quickly, but at least review them. And that's, some sites are already doing that. They compete in very competitive verticals, and it works pretty well. So that could be a way where you convey value through, hey, this is expert approved, and we have somebody who's actually studied in that field or worked in that field, who looked over that type of content and made sure it's factually correct and it's kind of on the point and whatnot. Another way is like bringing unique data to the table. So the different ways to get that. There are also very public sources, like some census stuff, for example, that everybody has access to. But what if you do your own survey, or what if you use data from your product, right? Like, I mean, at Shopify, we had access to some pretty significant data, and we leaned into that. And nobody can do that. There's nobody out there that has that same type of data, or that can maybe Amazon, right? But they never lean into this. So there are all sorts of ways. But I feel like, as you already said, there's so much stuff as table stakes, and competition happens in maybe like 5% of a margin instead of 50%, where maybe it was 10 years ago. So these days, if you don't have a competitive advantage, you probably have a disadvantage.
It's becoming more fun to be creative in that way, though, because I personally love doing the expertise-driven thought leadership, the data-driven thought leadership, all of that stuff. So we have a question from David. How do you figure out where... Well, first off, I want to say also, anybody can ask questions here, so please do. How do you figure out where to start building your first SEO growth loop? What's a prioritization framework for this?
It's basically, the way to identify this is to kind of like take your product and dissect it into all sorts of different steps. And what you want to look for are entities that you can expose to Google and scale them at large. So maybe an example from, let's see, maybe Instacart. I think they're doing a good job in SEO. I wrote about them recently, and they expose not just, so Instacart obviously is like a grocery shopping app. And the main entities in that universe are really the supermarkets you can order from, the kind of produce or the grocery type of stuff that you can order from, categories that those fall into. But then there are also locations, right? So if you're looking for stuff like grocery shopping in, Chicago, right? Like that is an entity as well. And what Instacart has done pretty well is they build landing pages or programmatic pages for all these types of entities. They expose it to Google. They do a really good job with FAQ schema and other schema type of stuff. And so this all comes from understanding all the different steps in your product. And then in these steps that users take, identify what are some entities that users encounter that we can build content around, and then expose that to search engines. Another example would be Trello, which we back then at Atlassian acquired. And Trello's entities are boards and cards. And so you can find all sorts of Trello boards in the Google search results because we made that accessible. It's really good content on there. And it's actually, it's the craziest stuff you find there. It's like company roadmaps, or it's like recipes from celebrity chefs and whatnot. But it all starts, again, with the user journey in the product, and then exposing a piece of the product or a part of the product to the Google search results, and making sure that you address a certain user intent that actually, where this information actually makes sense.
Love it. That's a great answer. this conversation, again, is criminally short, but I applaud your concision and value in your answers. That's amazing. I wanted to ask something out because we could do the SEO growth loop stuff for another hour or two. I wanted to ask one a little bit higher level about you and your SEO career. So I think you're an original novel voice in SEO. So what do you, and this is, a little self-reflection, what do you think your unique advantage is that has helped you in your SEO career? Like, what's your superpower?
Thanks, Alex. And by the way, it means a lot coming from you. Really appreciate you and your kind of words. What is my unique superpower? I think that for me, I'm good at seeing systems, right? I'm good at seeing the inputs and outputs and all the steps between that lead to a certain outcome and being very analytical about that. I think that has really served me. I've also gotten feedback that I'm a good communicator, even though I would challenge that at times. But I think I can structure things. I can really make things that seem a bit fuzzy and maybe even chaotic, put them in order. I think that's I would go with that answer.
I love it. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. Where can people find you online? Where do you want to point them to?
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the conversation. Love it. Super, great question. Great prep. And if you want to find me online, my website and free newsletter is kevin-indig.com. I also have a podcast called TechBound, and I'm on Twitter. I'm at Kevin_Indig.
I love it. Thank you so much. Only one announcement from me. Basically, we're doing a huge event on October 11th through the 13th. It's called the Road to Mastery, and it's going to be all about converting with content. So you've got 6 speakers, 3 entertainers, including a magician, a comedian, and a singer-songwriter. So that is, I think Carissa is going to send the link, but that's on our website. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.